Before this remarkable interview between Peter Levenda and Jim Marrs begins on Above Top Secret, I'd like to bring up some things that are available on the website. There's a new Whitley's Journal up about the economy and why everybody is missing the real reason for the crash. Also, the new 2009 Quick Watch page is either up when you listen to this or will be within the next couple of days. As well, you can follow me on Twitter now, twitter.com, Whitley Strieber. And keep up with me on Twitter. I'm on Facebook, MySpace, and Twitter as well. And with that said, we also have a beautiful premium this week. If you subscribe for 6 months or more, that is not 1 year, but 6 months or more, and have a U.S. address, that is a U.S. address, you will be eligible to receive one of the copies of Above Top Secret that we have to give away this week while supplies last. This offer starts at 6 a.m. Pacific time Saturday morning and goes on until there are no books left. We have no way of knowing whether you will get a book or not. You must have a U.S. address. You must subscribe for 6 months or longer. You must do this after 6 a.m. Saturday, March the 7th, 2008, and if books are available when you subscribe, you will receive one. This is a premium well worth having, and UnknownCountry.com subscriber section is a place well worth going. We have a wonderful living community there. Every Wednesday night we have an open chat. Ann and I are in attendance, and it's really a lot of fun to be an UnknownCountry.com subscriber. And now let's have some fun and get some extraordinary information from Peter Levenda and Jim Marrs.
My name is Peter Levenda, and I'm going to be your host this afternoon as we talk to Jim Marrs about his new book, Above Top Secret, which has just come out. Jim, how are you?
I'm just doing great, Peter. It's nice to be with you today.
Nice to be with you. I have to tell you, I read Alien Agenda years ago when it first came out, and I read that book cover to cover. I couldn't put it down. And now with your new book, Above Top Secret, it's the kind of book, it's got chapters on so many different topics, and you think you're going to pick it up and just pick a topic and start reading it. And before you know it, an hour has gone by or 2 hours have gone by, and you're reading all the chapters, and you can't help yourself. You're in a state of agitation. You may think, listeners may think that they know a lot about such things as Roswell, about the Kennedy assassination, about Nazi bases in Antarctica and all that stuff, until you read Jim Marrs' book, and then you realize how much you really didn't know. I don't know where to start, really. There's just so much material here.
Well, Peter,
to begin with.
I'm really pleased to hear you say that because I kind of thought, there's so many people out there, and particularly listeners to Dreamland, they're going to go, oh, Roswell, oh, Kennedy assassination, oh, yeah, I already know all that stuff. But the book, Above Top Secret, which tackles about 19 different conspiracy mystery issues, actually would be a great primer, a great starting place for anyone who has kind of an interest but doesn't really know anything about it. And yet, I find out that even people who have studied these issues really like the book and seem to be getting something out of it.
Well, it's true. I've written about some of these same things, and it's just incredible to me to go through your book and to be reminded of facts that I had forgotten, and to be introduced to things, and to even to different points of view, of which I was, totally unfamiliar before. And the layout of the book is great. Each chapter starts with the who, what, when, where, and why.
Isn't that great? And the design of the book, the folks at Above Top Secret really did an excellent job. It's got rounded corners, and it's very open and very reader friendly, and I've done the same thing. I kind of pick it up and see, oh, that looks nice, and then I get to reading it. The next thing you know, I'm 14 pages on.
Exactly. Well, that's what happened to me, and it's just it's quite an accomplishment. And I think anybody who has just even a passing interest in this sort of thing, they may think they know about, for instance, UFO stuff. Listeners to Dreamland, I'm sure, have read a lot and heard a lot about UFO phenomenon. But there's a lot of different cases that you mention here, and you give a lot of different types of proof and evidence, both for and against these various theories, that it's an eye-opener. And I think that people who feel secure and that they know about this material, picking up your book, they're going to have a whole bunch of different stories to deal with, a lot of different things. I mean, you may be involved in UFOs, and then suddenly you're going to read about, as I mentioned, Nazi bases in Antarctica. You know, it's going to open your mind to different ways of looking at reality. And I think that it's a great contribution. I was going to ask you, what was the most fascinating chapter? I think from your point of view. I mean, what did you really get involved with?
Well, I think, and of course, keep in mind, I've been dealing with conspiracies, for 30 years, 40 years, I guess. Yeah. The one though that really piqued my interest and I really got into writing was the little chapter about is God an alien? Uh-huh. We rarely ever stop to think about this. And of course, once I started dealing with that, I realized that there's actually two aspects to that question. One goes back, and I think that people have gotten mixed up a little bit because they read Zecharia Sitchin and they read other material and they read about ancient astronauts. And so a lot of folks kind of have the idea, or at least have the concept, that we, meaning the human race today, may be the offspring of extraterrestrials, which is, for a lot of mainstream people, a very far-out thought, and yet there is a lot of compelling evidence that points in that direction. But then that doesn't really address the question about is God an alien? These ETs, if they existed, if they did tweak our DNA and create modern man, they didn't actually create any race. In fact, they themselves said, no, we're not creating anything. We're just kind of improving the breed. Well, we do that today with horses and cows and dogs and cats and other animals. And so, what's the problem to think that they might have done something like that in the past? But again, that doesn't address the question of, were they God? No, they're not God. They're just one of God's creatures just like we are. And so then you get into, well, then, what exactly is God? And if you believe in a God, but you believe in a God that is separate from you, he's up there somewhere in the heavens on a cloud and has a big G on his sweatshirt or whatever, well, that obviously makes him alien to you. So then you have to start thinking about, well, if God is omnipotent and omnipresent and then perhaps we are all part of that. Anyway, it just gets you into some really deep philosophical thoughts, and I found that real fascinating.
Well, I did too. I mean, it's a question that has concerned me a lot in my most recent writing. I've been considering all of these issues. I mean, of course, Eric von Daniken started that whole ball rolling. Yeah. But then, of course, Zecharia Sitchin, as you mentioned, has done a lot of work on that, trying to understand the ancient Babylonian creation epics in terms of alien intervention, and creation of humans.
Well, Peter, do you see it? Do you see this kind of the way I do, which is that you can go to the Encyclopedia Britannica and you can look up Sumerian mythology, and they tell you all about Enki and Enlil and Nar-Shuk and all of these characters and tell all these stories. And the only real difference seems to be is that Sitchin and a growing number of other scholars are beginning to say, wait a minute, maybe this wasn't just made-up mythological stories. Maybe those people were actually trying to tell us what they knew and had experienced as their history. Do you see that?
Well, I do. I agree with you on that, especially because the most recent research that's been undertaken by people like Blauvelt and some of the others on Egyptian mythology and these incomprehensible pyramid texts and coffin texts seems to point to the idea that these are explanations of astronomical phenomena that were taking place. Mm-hmm. And Hamlet's Mill, of course, goes into that idea as well, that all of these myths are actually talking about real events, things that actually happened. They're not myths. I mean, they're not myths the way we understand myths. They're just ways of trying to explain something without using technological language, since they didn't have technological tools. in a mathematical language to express it. They had images.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I kind of agree with you on that we are talking about things that actually took place. It's just up to us to try to figure out what that means.
Well, you know what? I think we can see that right now with our own history. Most people, when they say, let's say since we're here in December, people go back and they talk about World War II, and as far as most young people know, well, Japan attacked America, and then we went into the war and we defeated Japan and Germany, and that's about it. That's kind of the myth,
Right.
And in a broad sense, that's true, but yet it totally misses all the nuances. The fact that Roosevelt had shut off the oil supplies to Japan, forcing them to take some kind of action, and that the only thing that made military sense was to cripple the Pacific Fleet so we couldn't wage war against them, which means a preemptive strike, just like we've done in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Sure.
And it also fails to take into consideration what is now becoming historic fact, that Roosevelt and a handful of others knew that Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked, and they allowed it to happen to further their own political agenda, which was to get an aroused and unified American public into the war. So, yeah, I see what you're saying. We only look. Some of our own history today is kind of mythological.
Well, speaking about that, you have a chapter on the infamous Kennedy assassination. Look at all the mythology that's been built up around that.
Exactly, that's true. Well, but one of them that did fascinate me, and this is great that you and I are getting to speak here, because I really would like your take on this whole thing about a Nazi base in Antarctica. That sounds pretty far out, and yet the facts of the German colonization and down at what used to be Queen Maud Land, and then they named it Neuschwabenland. That's historic fact. They were there. They did build bases, I guess. So the question is, did they build a huge, big underground base? And do you think they went there after the war? And do you think that it may still be in operation? And I'd like your take on that.
Well, from my point of view, from the documents that I've seen and the research that I've done, I know that the Nazis were very active in Latin America and South America, all the way down to Patagonia, down to the lowest parts of Argentina and Chile.
Right.
They were extremely active. They had a lot of money, a lot of influence. The Nazi Party there was very active during the war. We know that U-boats were scuttled off the coast of Patagonia, which is about as close as you can get to Antarctica without being there. So as far as I'm concerned, the possibility that the Nazis had a base in Antarctica, I think is very real. We have to kind of accept that really is a distinct possibility. As you mentioned in your book, you talk about the fact that, they had Peenemünde, they had all of these underground bases in Germany during World War II that we didn't know anything about. So it was entirely possible they could have built something in Antarctica that we don't know anything about. And all those U-boats that have gone missing, where do they wind up?
Exactly.
That's another
there were several that were, that there were some that showed up right at the end of the war and even after the war, but then there were apparently still a good number that have never been accounted for.
That's right. And that plus there's a lot of stuff that the Nazis had stolen that still has not shown up yet. There have been books by guys who worked for the U.S. military during the war who have written about, their suspicions that a lot of this went out on U-boats and disappeared somewhere. And Antarctica has always been a place that's been mentioned as a possibility. Well, we can get back to this in just a minute. This conversation is fascinating and could go on for hours, but I've got to take a break. You're listening to Dreamland, the interview with Jim Marrs on Above Top Secret. We'll be back in a moment.
LoveUnknownCountry.com. Do let your friends know about our website. We're suffering from the economy, too.
And we're back on Dreamland with Jim Marrs talking about his new book, Above Top Secret. My name is Peter Levenda. Jim, where we left off, we talked about a lot of strange things. I was going to start talking to you about Nazis and alternative energy sources. I think you have a chapter on that, or you brought up the Nazis, and then we went on to alternative energy. I think these days people are interested in alternative energy. Maybe you want to expand on that.
Well, kind of backing into that, Peter, I think this might fascinate you. Just the other day, I rented a movie called Outpost. And it's really nothing. It's kind of a grade B horror flick. Basically, it's the old formula. You get guys, these soldiers get modern day soldiers in Europe get trapped in an underground bunker where they have to fight off undead Nazis. Okay, so it's a cheap grade B movie, and yet in this movie, the whole premise is that this was an SS secret experimental station where they were working on a machine that created energy fields that would put you into a different dimension, and it was all based on Einstein's unified field theory and yada yada. And it's like, holy cow, these things that you and I were working on years ago and thought were so far out and ultra and everything else, and now it's staple Hollywood fare.
Gee, that's incredible, isn't it?
Isn't that amazing? And and because this machine, they never mentioned the bell, but it's obvious that's what this was. This whole thing was a reference to this machine that created energy fields that could alter time and space, and that's what the bell was all about, right?
That's what the bell was all about, sure. And the SS Ahnenerbe had a lot of bizarre practices like that, a lot of interest in that, in creating stations around the world that were built on the premise that there was a hollow Earth, for instance, and trying to use the heavens basically as a kind of a shield, and to find out what you were doing on the other side of the world using radar, bouncing it off of the sky. I mean, they had all kinds of odd ideas.
And
about
those
energy
odd ideas are now being put into practice, right? Because when you talk about bouncing signals off the ionosphere, you're talking about the HAARP array up in Alaska.
Exactly, right.
So I mean, apparently we got more than rocket science from the Nazis after the war.
Oh, well, I'm a firm believer in that. I mean, we brought over so many different kinds of scientists after the war under paperclip and some of the other practices that it wasn't just rocket science. It was medical science, it was energy science, and everything else. I don't think we've even touched the surface on that. There's so much that's still classified.
That's true. Well, of course, as far as I know, I think Nikola Tesla's, most of his work is still classified.
It is. Isn't that fascinating? They would have come and seized his papers. And you also mentioned Wilhelm Reich, one of my favorite guys, and his orgone research, and the fact that our government would have burned books as late as 1960. We burned all of his books and papers and files in Gansevoort Station down in New York City. I mean, I have a hard time believing that we would do something like that, but there it is.
But there it is. We did it, It is absolutely amazing. So maybe you better run out and buy a copy of Above Top Secret before they start burning that.
Yeah, my sentiments exactly. I mean, well, look what they did to that poor guy. I mean, what crime did he possibly commit except that he was, he was suspicious about fascism and he was suspicious about communism, and he wrote a lot about both, but he also claimed to have a cure for cancer. And, his research was pretty fascinating, this idea that
and supposedly in a free country, why can't we hear about all his research and have various people experiment with it and check it out? And, if it proves to be fraudulent and all various and sundry groups and people check it out and they say, no, this is fraudulent, then you just ignore him and you forget about it. But if he did have a cure for cancer, well, then holy cow. That's been kept from us.
Exactly. It's something that we should know about, but as you talk about it, he had discovered this alternate source of energy, or not necessarily alternate, a deeper source of energy, orgone.
Right.
He built machines, to collect this energy.
I can't help but think that he was laughed at because he said, we're surrounded by this orgone energy. But today, leading physicists are talking about 0-point energy. It sounds to me like they're kind of onto the same thing. They're just calling it different names.
Oh, sure. And in biological science, I mean, just in biology, they claim that there's a kind of a force field around the body, that each cell creates its own energy as well. I mean, his idea of orgone is not, far-fetched anymore. I mean, it's within the realm of possibility considered scientifically. But Reich is a good connection point because not only was he politically active and politically he was making a lot of statements about politics. He was also involved in alternate energy. and he was involved in UFO research.
Well, any one of those, if you get a little too close to the truth, can cause you a problem. So I guess we can see why they threw him in jail and burned all his books.
Yeah. I mean, I just find, I read your book and I remember all of this and I see it all in one place, and that's the beauty of it. I mean, you're reading Above Top Secret and you've got it all in one place. If you really wanted to go out and start searching for information, I mean, this book gives you a place to start. It gives you the questions to ask, and it gives you the data, which is very important. And I love your warning at the end of the book, how to be very careful what you find on the internet, and to make sure you test it and verify what you're reading.
That's very, very true because, Peter, the upside of the internet is that anybody and everybody has access to the internet. The downside, however, is that anybody and everybody has access to the internet.
Right.
So I consider myself quite fortunate that I had a pretty full lifetime behind me before the internet came along. So I feel like that I am pretty capable of discernment and pretty capable of trying to figure out what's real and not real on the internet. Plus, I know a lot of people might not believe this, but I consider myself quite a skeptical person. I want to see all the evidence before I jump on anything, and that's one thing that you really have to take with you when you go surfing on the internet, because there is just so much stuff up there, and it ranges, from hidden truth all the way down to blatant lies. So you have to be pretty careful.
Yeah, I agree. And again, for the listeners, the book we're talking about is Above Top Secret. And what it contains is really some very, how shall I say, hard-headed approach to some of these so-called conspiracy theories. I mean, what Jim is doing is he's giving you the facts, he's giving you the names and the dates and the places, and he's saying this is what happened, and draw your own conclusions. The conclusions you draw from some of this stuff is pretty scary sometimes, but there you go. I find that, there were things I didn't really know. I mean, the spidery drones, that, just the title alone, you've got to read that chapter, right?
Yeah, and that one has been the object of, first, just so everybody know what we're talking about. And a lot of people have never even heard about it. But over the past several years, there have been many different people who not only have seen but have photographed these strange hovering devices, I guess, that kind of look like, I guess, those probes that you saw in Star Wars. They're kind of circular, and there's like little appendages sticking out, and sometimes things hanging down to where it almost looks like a spider type thing, but they're obviously mechanical, and they've been seen in the air and photographed. And yet, somebody pulled a very slick move, if this was the conscious intention, and that was they took one of the still photographs that Witness had taken, and then they photoshopped it and turned it into a little animated thing, had it moving around the air, which was pretty cool. But then once that got on the internet and people started talking about it, then, experts, quite truthfully, came back and said, oh, well, that's just photoshopped. Oh, everybody says, okay, so they just forgot about that. It's like it didn't happen. It's kind of the same thing. It's the same type of, the same things that magicians use, where they, they do something with their right hand while they're actually doing something with the left hand. There's a word for that, and it's slipping past me right now.
Misdirection, I think.
Misdirection, absolutely. It's misdirection. And the same thing happened, and I cover this in the chapter about what flew over Phoenix. This huge object was seen flying over Phoenix about 8:30 at night, and then after that, somebody ordered the Maryland State Guard to go out outside of town and drop military flares over the Barry Goldwater gunnery range, and which they did about 10 o'clock that night. And then months later is when the story finally hit the public consciousness, and everybody wanted to know, well, gee, what flew over Phoenix? Well, they said, oh, well, it was military flares. And the few news people who were, astute enough to go try to check on it. They checked with the Maryland State Guard, and they were told, yes, we flew out there, and yes, we dropped military flares. So they said, oh, well, okay, so is military flares. Never mind, folks. And the whole story kind of dropped from sight. But, of course, what really bugs me as a former newspaper reporter is why didn't they take the time and trouble to simply check and find out that what everybody reported as strange and huge over the city was at 8:30, and the lights that a lot of people saw that obviously were the military flares was at 10:30, 2 hours later.
Right.
It's misdirection.
Well, it is, and and once it hits the mainstream media, and they come out with the story, it's unbelievable the way everyone accepts that as the truth. I mean, that's the truth, not what they saw with their own eyes, but what they hear on the news.
Exactly, and that goes all the way back to even more naive times in the Kennedy assassination. I can't tell you how many people I talked to who were there in Dealey Plaza when the shots were fired, and they said, and I said, where do you think the shots came from? They said, well, we thought it came from the grassy knoll down there, but, and then they always say, but the government, proved it came from the book depository. So then they say, well, so where do you think it came from? Well, I guess it came from the book depository. I mean, right. The official word just, it's like, who are you going to believe? Your government or your own lying eyes?
Right, exactly.
It's amazing.
Well, I'm here talking with Jim Marrs on his book Above Top Secret. You're listening to Dreamland. We have to take a break, but we'll be right back.
This is Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. Expert hosts, unique information.
And we're back on Dreamland. My name is Peter Levenda, and we're talking to Jim Marrs about his new book, Above Top Secret. And we're talking about who you're going to believe. Who are you going to believe, Jim? You've gotten everything here from even the 9/11 episode. I mean, was that an inside job? All the way to with the moon landing staked. I mean,
exactly.
Who are you going to believe? Where do you start?
Well, and speaking of was 9/11 an inside job, which if you actually look at all the evidence, it seems quite clear that yes, it was. The only question was, is this like Pearl Harbor, and is this something they allowed to happen to further their own political agenda, or is this something they actually perpetrated? That's the big question. But here's what's really fascinating is that, as you probably well remember, and I know Whitley Strieber would too, that back at the time of the Kennedy assassination, for about 15 years, it was just considered impolite and not socially acceptable to even talk about it in public or in polite company, right? And and then finally they got another the House Assassination Committee. They got that thing going, the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And then all of a sudden, and then the Zapruder film became available to the public. And all of a sudden it became, well, okay, I guess we can talk about it. And we've been talking about it ever since, and now everybody realizes that there was a big conspiracy involved in the killing of Kennedy. Well, I'm here to tell you that we're in that same type situation with 9/11. We're 8 years out, and it's just not considered proper to in polite company to really talk about it. But I guarantee you at some point it's going to crack open, and it, unfortunately, we may see the same thing as with the Kennedy assassination. It may take another 40 years, but at some point, everybody is going to go, 9/11, oh, yeah, that was an inside job. They're just going to know it because the evidence is all there.
Well, this is the thing about the manipulation of reality. I did some research years ago about the word real, and our word real has the same root as the word royal. I mean, it's whatever the king says is real.
Well, does real come from the? Excuse me, Peter. Does real come from the French real, which has to do with blood, the bloodline?
Well, yeah. If you're talking about the term sangreal, like the Holy Grail,
right?
What that means is royal blood. In Spanish, also, real can be both well, the word real or the word royal, depending upon how it's used.
Right.
So
but
real
that's
and royal.
probably where our word real comes from.
Right.
In reality.
Well, as in reality, or as in real estate.
Yeah.
Reality is what's in the kingdom. Outside the kingdom, nothing is real. Here there be monsters.
Right.
So the king or the president or whoever is controlling your country determines reality. I mean, there's the consensus reality. And we all agree as to what is real and what is not. And when times change, consensus reality changes, I think. So we were able to look back at the Kennedy assassination and say, yeah, obviously there was a lot more going on there than, some lone nut in the book depositing. So we're going to be looking at 9/11 the same way. I mean, when it happened, I thought this is all we need. This is a Reichstag fire. This
exactly.
is the excuse we need to go nuts. So.
Well, and it followed precisely and almost to the day a year, because in September of 2000, we had the neocon position paper, Rebuilding America's Defenses, published by the Project for a New American Century, which was a neocon think tank. And they laid it out. They said, we need to put more American troops into the Middle East to gain control of the oil supply. We need to invade Afghanistan. We need to have regime change in Iraq. And but whoever wrote that paper was pretty prescient. They said, but this is going to be a hard sell to the American public unless there is a catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. And a year later, they got it.
They got it, exactly. So, I mean,
really amazing.
Is this a conspiracy? Is this definite political conspiracy? Is this something more obscure, something more arcane? Like my famous Sinister Forces.
Well, the Sinister Forces. While we're on Sinister Forces, in your trilogy, you certainly laid the foundation for the belief that there is Sinister Forces, behind the scenes, manipulating everything. Peter, do you believe that that's some kind of nebulous force, or do you believe that there are actually people plotting in unison to accomplish these things?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. I think there's a nebulous force, if you will. There's a force, a sort of a quantum force of history, if you will. And I think that there are people who are aware of it and aware of how this force can be manipulated for their own purposes. So I think it's a combination of both. I think the force exists. I think that the Kennedy assassination is a great, example of this. As I've asked before, is the Kennedy assassination a particle or a wave? From the point of view of quantum physics, it depends how you want to measure it. Is it a conspiracy or is it some weird, set of coincidences? I think there's a third.
Let me lay this on you. I'm not sure you're aware of this, and I'm not sure that Trieber's aware of this, and I know that the audience is not, but I'm going to blow you away right here, because to me this is proof that there is not only conspiracies, but there is a huge, grand, sinister force conspiracy. If you go back and look at the events in the Kennedy family, namely the deaths of the Kennedy siblings, and there's an extra one in that most people don't remember, but in 1964, there was a near fatal plane crash for Ted Kennedy. So you go back, you've got Joe Kennedy Jr., who was killed in August of 1944 near England when his plane exploded. And then you've got John F. Kennedy, who was shot in the head and assassinated in Dallas on November the 22nd, 1963. Then you got Edward Kennedy, who almost died in a plane crash in June of 1964. Then you got Robert Kennedy, who was assassinated in Los Angeles in June of 1968. And then you got John F. Kennedy Jr., who died in a plane crash in July of 1999. Now, these took place over a span of 50 years, and ranging from England to Los Angeles to Dallas. You'd think there was no connection. And yet, unless you stop and realize that our way of keeping time is problematic, because, right now it's it's a certain time in Central Time Zone, but it's a different time on the West Coast and the East Coast. So astrophysicists and astrologers and military people, they needed to come up with a convention of time that did not change due to the Earth's daily rotation. So what they came up with is called sidereal time. And, Peter, I'm sure you're probably familiar with that.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And sidereal time is time based on the positions of the stars. This is, of course, has been used for decades by the ancient sailors, of course, would map their course by the stars, but they also kept time by the stars because it's called sidereal time. And sidereal time is broken into 24 sidereal hours. And these never change no matter where you are on the earth because it's based on the relation of the earth to the heavens, right?
Right.
Okay. These 5 Kennedy tragedies, 4 deaths and 1 near death, all occurred within the 16th sidereal hour.
My goodness.
Now think about that. And this has been confirmed by the Vatican Observatory in Tucson, Arizona. Now,
well,
what are the odds? What are the odds that all 5 members of this one family would either meet their death or near death all within the same hour? The odds
have to be astronomical.
Yeah.
I mean, no pun intended.
It's just beyond the realm of possibility. So what we see here is the only explanation for this is that it was planned this way. And then that makes you wonder, who's doing the planning and what do they know that we don't know?
Well, exactly. And that requires, that either requires a massive conspiracy, as the critics of the Kennedy assassination conspiracies have always said, or conversely, it requires maybe only a handful of people who are able to manipulate things in such a way as to cause this to happen.
Exactly. Exactly.
So you're back to what you started talking about, which is a Sinister Forces conspiracy on a grand scale. I've never heard this before until today, and I doubt any of our listeners have heard this either.
No. This is based on the work by a man named Bob Fisher. And when he first approached me with this, I said, "Oh, come on," But then when I saw the letter from the Vatican Observatory, and you do your computations, and you find out that that's exactly true, all within the same hour. It's just, there's something going on there. I wished I knew what it was.
Well, it is, and you've actually left me speechless here. I don't know how to follow this up. I'm sitting here thinking about this, and that's incredible.
But I know
if anybody wants
this will cause you some sleepless nights, because when you think about it, the odds of it being chance are just almost non-existent. And so then the only way you could explain it is that somehow it was planned this way. And so then you start thinking, but who plans, in 50-year intervals? Not most of us.
No, exactly. I don't know. I'm still speechless, but it's probably a good thing that I'm speechless because we're coming up to a break. And I need a little time to collect myself here. We were talking to Jim Marrs about his new book, Above Top Secret. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Dreamland. Serious wonder spoken here.
And we're back. This is Peter Levenda speaking with Jim Marrs about his new book, Above Top Secret. You're listening to Dreamland. Jim, I don't know what to say, man, but you blew my mind just a few minutes ago, and I'm still trying to figure out how to come back on this one. But yes,
while you're wondering about that one, what are your thoughts on my chapter in the new book, Above Top Secret, Who Parked the Moon?
Yeah. Well, I had originally come across this idea actually in your other book, Alien Agenda, from years ago. I was sitting on a plane traveling to the Far East, and I had this book with me. I just picked it up, and I'm going through it, and I couldn't sleep on the plane, so I arrived completely jet-lagged to where I was going. But anyway, this idea that the moon is an artificial satellite is a stunner. I mean, it's a stunning piece of theory, and yet when you read the evidence that you've collected to support this theory, I mean, you're left flabbergasted.
because it's the only logical explanation. Even Isaac Asimov, who, on top of being a great science fiction writer, was also a great scientist, said the moon should not be where it is. It's virtually impossible that an object coming in from space being captured by the gravitational field of the Earth would go into a near-perfect circular orbit around the equator and stationary with one side always facing the Earth and at just the proper distance from the Earth so that when it passes between the Earth and the Sun, it completely blocks out the circumference of the Sun, but not the corona. So it's like, how could that be? And again, the only logical explanation is that it was intelligently parked in that orbit. But now we get to the circular thinking that comes into play when we start talking about UFOs or extraterrestrials. We know the moon has been there all throughout our recorded history, and we know we didn't put it up there, and we know that there's no such things as ETs. So what do we do about this orbit of the moon? We just don't talk about it.
Exactly. Because all of our premises, there's a problem in our premises somewhere. You know, either we did put it up there, either we had the technology at one point, and we've forgotten about it, or someone else came along and did it. I mean, those are the only two alternatives, aren't they? I mean,
that's exactly right. And either way, conventional thought is thrown into a tizzy, because if it turns out that there was that kind of technology in the distant past, then we have to throw out all our history books and all our archaeological books. And if it turns out that it was somebody other than us, then we have to chunk the whole idea that this is it, we're it, this is the end of existence right here on this world.
Well, I mean, what was the motivation for parking the moon where it is? What do you think was the purpose behind it?
Well, assuming that it's an artificial satellite, and there's, as you well know, there's a lot of evidence that points in that direction, I think it would be, I guess, like we saw in Star Wars. It's a Death Star, you know. It's they took a small moonlet, a natural moon, but then they hollowed it out, which explains the mascons and the flow of lava on the surface of the moon, even though the moon has no volcanic activity. They hollowed it out, and then they flew it through space. And this explains the bulge on one side of the moon where they have found rocks that have been dated to even older than the Earth. That's the windshield. That's the bugs on the windshield as it goes through space. And then they get here to the Earth, and they say, okay, we're going to park it around this planet right here. So they say, take us down, you know, to a distance to where we're not going to be drawn into the gravity field and, you know, smashed up and burned up, and yet we're not going to be far enough out to where we get loose and fly out into space. We're going to park it in just the perfect distance orbit so that we will stay in orbit, and then we want to observe this world, so let's make it stationary so that it's always facing the world. And just for the heck of it, we'll put it out here at just the proper distance so that when you're on the Earth and you look towards the sun and the moon comes in, then you'll have a lunar eclipse, and that would really be cool. And since they have the capability of parking it where they want to, then they just parked it at an advantageous place for all of that.
Well, I mean, do you think they're still there? Are they coming back for it, or what?
Hey, don't ask me. They don't talk to me. But but when you look at all of the evidence and all of the reports and narratives about people seeing lights moving on the moon, even our astronauts, even Buzz Aldrin and Armstrong, the day before they landed on the moon in August of '69, they reported seeing lights coming out of a crater. Out of a crater, not going into a crater, coming out of the crater. And that made it past the censors, because at that time we were thinking that the moon was volcanic, and so they were saying that was probably, lava flows or volcanic activity. It was only after we actually got there that we found out that there's no volcanic activity on the moon. And the fact that they've seen these moving lights, the fact that they've seen structures appear and disappear on the surface of the moon for centuries, tends to indicate to me that there's still somebody up there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all kidding aside, I mean, the evidence that you've presented in that chapter is pretty overwhelming. I mean, and of course, an alien agenda. I mean, when you started off, I mean, it's just there's a tremendous amount of information. You don't know how to fit the information into your standard narrative. The standard scientific narrative about the universe,
exactly,
or about it does not fit. There's too many anomalies.
That's why most of that information on the moon is still in what I call my file. You just
right.
you get all that information, you go, and then you just file it away for future reference to see if whatever comes up. And of course, I've been filing stuff away on the moon ever since I started put Alien Agenda together back in the 90s, and everything that comes out, we now know that there's an atmosphere on the moon. We know there's water on the moon. Everything we thought we knew about the moon turns out to be wrong. So it's still a very, very mysterious object, and I still, in Alien Agenda, I called it the greatest UFO because it is a flying object, and it is still unidentified. We're not sure exactly what it is.
Yeah, I mean, it was a stunner when I read it then, and I'm reminded of it again in Above Top Secret. Listeners, you've got to get yourself a copy of this book because you're going to have a lot of stuff to talk about with your friends at the water cooler with this stuff.
Yeah, and for example, I ended up with the chapter on what's going to happen in 2012, and a lot of people hadn't been paying attention to 2012, or they hear about it, and they say, oh, yeah, the Mayan calendar ends in 2012, and then you got some people who say, well, who cares what a bunch of crazy Indians thought, they were probably smoking something, and then you got others who say, the world's going to end, and I think it's somewhere in between there. I think we'll all still be here in 2013, but I will say that I think that we're going to be able, from the standpoint of 2013, we're going to look back and we're going to say, we're not living in the same world we were in 2008. Just like today in 2008, we can look back and agree that we're not living in the same world we were living in the year 2000. Right,
exactly. I mean, change is happening anyway, regardless of the calendar. But for 2012, though, there's a lot of speculation out there because of the Mayan calendar. It's tantalizing to think that, from an astrological instead of an astronomical point of view, that it does signal some kind of major change. But sometimes we tend to think of these things in a kind of Eurocentric point of view or an American-centric point of view, What does this really mean for people living in China, for instance, or people living in Peru or wherever,
Yeah. Well, there's an old saying, Peter, that if everybody tells you don't look well, maybe you ought to lie down. and if it was just the Mayan calendar, I could kind of brush that off. But when you go back and consider that Mother Shipton, Nostradamus, you just go right on, the Hopis, the Egyptians, Kabbalists, Essenes, the Karo elders of Peru, the Navajos, Cherokees, the Iroquois, the Dogon tribe in Africa, and the Aborigines in Australia, and they all point to 2012. Maybe we better start paying attention to it.
And exactly. We better start paying attention. I mean, there's something to this, and it would be nice if we could figure out, really what that is. And you mentioned a possibility of a spiritual renaissance or a spiritual shift in consciousness, maybe.
See, that would be world changing. That would change our reality, wouldn't it?
It sure would.
By the way, I meant to mention this earlier when we were talking about reality. My thought is this, Peter. I think they need to change the dictionary, and instead of reality as a singular noun, they ought to make it realities as a plural noun, because we all live in our own little reality. So there is no true basic reality. It's just however we individually perceive it. And actually, I kind of got onto this idea years and years ago as a newspaper reporter, because in the morning I'd be interviewing the president of the bank in his plush offices at the top of a big modern skyscraper. And in the afternoon, I'd be interviewing the welfare mother living out in the projects somewhere. And I began to realize those people don't live in the same reality.
Exactly.
And so I don't think any of us live in the same reality. So I think the whole idea that we're all in one reality is fallacious.
Well, it's a heavy statement, and actually it's probably a good one to end this interview on. I wish it could go on for another hour or two, because I have a lot of questions based on your book, Above Top Secret. There's just so much in there, and I wish we could go on for a lot more. But anyway, this is Dreamland. My name is Peter Levenda. I've been interviewing Jim Marrs for the last hour or so on his latest book, Above Top Secret. You've got to go out. You've got to read this. It's going to give you food for thought for a long time to come. Jim, thanks very much. I enjoyed it very much. It was great. Thanks. And goodbye from Dreamland.
This is Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. Next up, Linda Moulton Howe.
This week, Linda has a story for us from down under, a very bizarre story about whales washing up on a beach in large numbers, but again and again and again on exactly the same beach. And why? Well, one of the ways you can keep up with stories like this is by going every day to Linda Moulton Howe's earthfiles.com. Linda Moulton Howe is Dreamland's award-winning science reporter. She wins awards because she gives us the facts that others will not. Here she is from Albuquerque, New Mexico, Linda Moulton Howe.
Well, thanks, Whitley. Scientists who study whales and dolphins are puzzled about repeated strandings of large numbers of pilot whales, which are actually large dolphins, and sperm whales and other dolphins in about the same area of Scott Island near Tasmania, Australia. Tasmania is south of the Melbourne, Australia, on what would be the east side of Australia and at the very tip south. And then there was highly strange, perhaps unprecedented behavior in Manila Bay, Philippines last month on February 10th, when 500 melon-headed dolphins filled Manila Bay and swam back and forth as if completely disoriented for hours and hours and hours. Whales, dolphins, and porpoises are also known as cetaceans. All cetaceans are mammals that once lived on land about 50 to 60 million years ago. In fact, their closest living genetic relatives are hippopotamuses. Something made cetacean ancestors leave land for the seas, and now whales, dolphins, and porpoises live in the oceans, rivers, and seas. But because they are mammals, they still must breathe oxygen into their lungs. That's what the blowholes are for on top of their heads. As deep as some whales dive, within an hour or two, the big creatures must swim back to the surface to breathe. Like mammals, cetaceans also give birth to live young, but underwater. Whales use a form of sonar called echolocation to locate and identify objects around them. It also is thought that whales use the Earth's magnetic fields to help navigate. Whales and dolphins generally live between 40 and 90 years, and species such as sperm whales grow up in very close family pods that travel and hunt together all of their lives. Unlike those very tight whale and dolphin families, porpoises are more individual and less group-dependent. That difference might be one of the reasons why whales and dolphins strand themselves on beaches, while usually porpoises do not. The unanswered scientific question is, do healthy whales and dolphins follow a family leader onto beaches for unknown reasons, even when beaching can mean death for some or all of the family pod. This week, I talked with a whale expert about the most recent March 2nd mysterious dolphin stranding and the previous 3 dolphin and sperm whale strandings, all near Scott Island, north of Tasmania. He is Scott Baker, Ph.D., Associate Director of the Marine Mammal Institute at Oregon State University, an Adjunct Professor of Molecular Ecology and Evolution at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Dr. Baker received his Ph.D. in zoology with a study of humpback whales in southeast Alaska and Hawaii, and he, too, is puzzled by this recent string of the strandings of so many of the dolphins and whales in the same area north of Tasmania.
Tasmania has had a series of strandings over the last few months. Beginning in November in 2008, about 4 months ago, they had 60 pilot whales strand on Anthony Beach, which is on the western edge of northern Tasmania, not far from King Island. And then on November 29th, another 150 stranded, again, in a very similar area. Unfortunately, in that second very large stranding, all the animals died. Then in January, there was a stranding of about 50 sperm whales, again, in a very similar area, and they all died. It's very difficult to attempt any kind of rescue on such large animals. And then most recently, just a few days ago, this group of nearly 200 pilot whales and a small number of bottlenose dolphins. This is a little unusual, having 4, most of which involving such a large number of animals.
What is your professional guess, given a long career with cetaceans, about what is going on?
Well, I think first it's fair to admit that we have no agreed scientific explanation for these kinds of mass strandings. But it is important to realize that first, these are highly social animals, and that's what characterizes these mass strandings from other sorts of strandings of single individuals. So these kind of mass strandings don't occur with baleen whales, that is, humpback whales or gray whales or blue or fin. Those animals may strand, but only as individuals. The mass stranding, large numbers, are only these highly social species like longfin pilot whales and sperm whales. It's also thought that these animals associate around matriarchs, that they have what's called a matrilineal society. So in some cases, male and female offspring of a mother may remain with the pod all their lives. And that gives this sort of social cohesion or social bond that's thought to be very important probably in initiating these events. But what causes them? That's really just not been possible to determine. But there are a number of reasonable theories. The one that's probably been, I think, generally accepted for the last few decades is that the whales move into these shallow areas, like a shallow, sloping, sandy beach, and their sonar becomes confused because the sonar bounces off of the shallow slope and doesn't return to them. So they think they're in deep water when, in fact, they're moving into shallow areas, and then they become trapped.
But whales left land about 60 million years ago, if I understand the literature correctly.
That's correct, yes, about 60 million years ago.
Okay. And you would think in 60 million years that this large animal evolving in the oceans would not be vulnerable to something like echolocation being fouled up by approaching close to shore.
Well, all animals, just like humans, make mistakes. We're seeing, an economic mass stranding, occurring here in the U.S. Social animals, part of the cost of sociality is group thinking, and that leads to stampedes. It leads to stock market crashes. But I think that is a component of this. So these are very sophisticated animals with very sophisticated sonar, but anyone can make a mistake.
4 mass strandings in 4 months suggests that something might be going on, and I'm curious if you have seen lab results from the necropsies on the animals yet.
No, I don't think there's been time for that. And typically, these have not shown anything. I'm not aware of really any mass stranding in Australia or New Zealand, and there have been many of them, where necropsy results suggested that there was widespread illness among the individuals. Most of them appear to be healthy. Now, that's not to say that one of these individuals is not sick, and that might be a key individual. but it's been very difficult to determine that. There were nearly 200 individuals in this mass stranding, 150 of which died. It would be very unusual to be able to complete detailed necropsy. It would be impossible on all of them. So if one of them was the key matriarch and that individual was sick, unfortunately we only have a fairly low probability of detecting that.
Well, I have in front of me an article about the whole history of beached cetaceans.
Right.
That begins this way. Another means by which sonar could be hurting whales is a form of decompression sickness. This was first raised by pathological examinations after 14 beaked whales stranded in the Canary Islands. The stranding happened on September 24, 2002, close to the operating area of Neo-Tapan, which was an international naval exercise, for about 4 hours after the activation of mid-frequency sonar. The team of scientists found acute tissue damage from gas bubble lesions, which are indicative of decompression sickness. The precise mechanism of how sonar causes bubble formation is not fully known. It could be due to whales panicking and surfacing too rapidly in an attempt to escape the sonar pulses. Could there be some kind of secret operation going on, and the only way to confirm this would be necropsies on all of the available dead bodies?
Well, the decompression hypothesis is actually pretty well established now in those cases where it appears that it's a response to this Navy mid-range sonar. You're right, that description is quite accurate. The sound is apparently stampeding the animals into a shallow area, and then the animals are pushed up into shallow depths where they haven't had time to decompress. Now, this came as a bit of a surprise to a lot of biologists involved in the study of marine mammals, because we had long assumed that cetaceans, whales, and dolphins had some form of natural protection against the bends. But it turns out that that may have been not entirely correct, that if they are deep-diving animals, pilot whales and sperm whales are in that category, along with beaked whales, are suddenly driven up into shallow water where they can't perform a series of these sort of semi-decompression dives to moderate depths, that they could be suffering the bends. Now, I would also, though, admit that if it is a military operation, whether we can obtain that information, I can't be absolutely sure of that, but I could be quite sure that there will be an attempt made to obtain that information. Certainly military operations are a potential, and there have been places where there's been quite a direct correlation, almost certainly a causal mechanism involved. But mass strandings of pilot whales have been going on since the time of Aristotle. He commented on them in the Mediterranean 2,500 years ago. He had no explanation for them either. But there is an alternate hypothesis in this case, and that has been proposed by some Australian scientists based on the pattern of mass strandings over the last few decades, that there are these decadal, about every 10-year cycles of westerly winds that shift the areas of productivity in that part of the world.
Well, do you mean by productivity that the food that the whales live off of would be going in different parts of the ocean?
Exactly, would be perhaps shifted more inshore or into this area of fairly shallow sandy banks. And the whales, pilot whales and the sperm whales, in pursuing their prey into these somewhat unfamiliar territories, these shallow waters are actually getting confused, disoriented, and stranding themselves.
Whales and dolphins are supposed to be highly intelligent, correct?
Most whales and dolphins have a very high degree of cognitive ability, that is, that we would consider intelligence, something comparable to our own problem-solving abilities, yes.
Doesn't that make strandings even more mysterious, especially at the level of 200, regardless of social groupings, that they are so intelligent, they have been living and evolving in the oceans of this planet for 60 million years, and it makes it seem so difficult to understand why they would not already know how to avoid these situations that put them into beaches.
I agree. I think it's one of the great mysteries of sociality in this case, because I think it is somehow tied to the fact that these species, longfin pilot and sperm whales primarily, are highly social.
Now, what is your own opinion about the possibility that magnetic field anomalies, it could be an underground volcano erupting, it could be a seismic event, it could be that there really is some pole shifting to South Africa, and then solar flares that can interrupt with the magnetic fields and cause anomalies. What is your own personal feeling about magnetic field anomalies affecting the cetaceans and causing beachings?
Well, I think it's unlikely to be the causal explanation for the beachings. It may, though, have some association with where these strandings occur, because they do seem to occur in specific areas over time, repeatedly. And it may well be that these are on these magnetic paths that the animals are using for navigation. We don't really know the extent to which they rely on magnetic cues, but it seems likely that it's certainly possible that there are some magnetic cues that they use. If so, then they may be following these paths, and if these beaches are on or near those paths, then they're simply in the way of the movement of the animal. So it's not a causal mechanism, it's a happen chance.
But again, it seems as if these very intelligent, large, evolving animals should not succumb to confusion with their echolocation and magnetic fields.
Well, that is one of the puzzling aspects of the strandings. The animals often seem to be intentionally stranding, and this is something that some of the hypotheses don't explain. And this was true at least in some of these recent events in Tasmania. An effort was made to return the animals to deeper water, and in some cases the animals simply turned around and went straight back. And that's most easily explained by this social phenomena, this group panic or group distress. The individuals that are taken out into deep water, they may want to be in deep water. They may recognize they're in deep water, but they hear the distressed calls of their kin on the beach, and they simply go back. We might say that that's not a very adaptive mechanism, but it's the part of the cost of this sociality, just like disease is the cost of sociality. We live in large groups, and so we're susceptible to epidemics. And so you might say, well, why live in a large group? We should all be living in little huts, 10 or 15 miles away from each other. But there are benefits to living together, and there are benefits to the sociality of these species. These are very successful species. Their populations worldwide, hundreds of thousands of individuals, but they are susceptible to these tragic mistakes.
Well, they're such wonderful creatures. And as one of the people said on this recent Scott Island in Tasmania, it broke my heart to hear them crying.
I agree with that. To hear them on the beach dying, surrounded by their friends and their family, is quite tragic.
And hard to understand if they are healthy.
Well, almost certainly some or even most of them are healthy. And that's what makes it, I think, all the more puzzling. But it may well be individuals within the group that are truly in distress of some kind.
How do you go forward from here as a cetacean expert with others in studying these strandings, these beachings of so many animals if they persist?
Well, we need to know more about them in the wild. So one of our interests has been taking the methods that we've used to study the genetic relatedness, the kinship of these individuals on the beach, and apply that to living populations in the wild, that is, ones that are not in distress. Because some of what we found with these stranded pods was a little unexpected. We found, in fact, they were not all close relatives to each other. They were not all part of the same matriline. They appear to be mixes of different groups. And we need to know if that's the case in the wild. We can also begin to better understand their movement patterns with methods like satellite tagging. And I did notice that the Australian scientists were able to put a small number of these satellite tags on some of the animals that had stranded late last year. And I happened to be with a colleague from the Australian Marine Mammal Center, Nick Gales, and he reported that these tags had been quite successful and that the animals that had been saved, that had been released back into the deeper water, some of them seemed to behave quite normally and moved back out into deep water and seemed to be swimming together again.
Well, then, Dr. Baker, did you ask him, why do you think they stranded in the first place?
Nick and I have had long conversations about this. All marine mammal scientists have these conversations over a couple of beers every evening, and we would cover pretty much the exact range of them that you and I have covered today. But we don't have a single explanation. There may not be a single explanation each stranding may be a little bit different.
Well, if you found a mixture of what would be not relatives in a pod with others that were not part of a blood family, doesn't that increase the possibility that there is something in the environment that periodically changes enough to disorient the cetaceans and cause these huge strandings?
Well, it does shift a little bit the likelihood of some of the explanations, but without the knowledge of what their natural social groupings are, I don't think we can yet interpret that too much. If we go out and we find that these large pods are typically made up of a mix of different family groups, so it's really unlikely that they could be close relatives to that many individuals. It may be that there's a smaller family groups, but that they associate together just as we do in communities, and those communities have almost as much cohesion as the blood kin.
But there's still a possibility in the Scott Island, huge stranding of the pilot whales and a few dolphins, and the previous 3 strandings in Tasmania, that there might be something going on in the environment that no human yet understands that's causing these massive repeated strandings.
Causing or influencing. So if this hypothesis about these 10-year shifts in prey are correct, and there may be large numbers of them out there all the time, but moving around safely, so to speak, without making mistakes. But it may be that they're now pursuing prey into areas that they're just not familiar with. That would be a consistent explanation for the fact that there have been 3 of these pilot whales and the sperm whale, given that the 2 species feed on similar prey, particularly deep-water squid. So if the wind patterns have driven the deep-water squid up into shallower water, then these animals are just in unfamiliar territory, so to speak.
So a larger context of possible cause for all of these recent large strandings off of Tasmania, the melon-headed dolphins in Manila Bay, might be related to global warming, i.e. temperatures are changing, water temperatures are changing, and that means that species in the food chain that have been in various parts of the oceans could be changing, migrating away from certain temperatures, and this might be affecting the cetaceans?
Well, that's possible. I don't know that it's explained these particular events and the melon-headed whales in the Philippines. I think we have to look in more detail at local patterns. The waters around Australia or Tasmania almost certainly are warming. Whether that's good or bad for the pilot whales is, of course, harder to tell. In New Zealand, where the pilot whales strand along quite a gradient of latitude from near tropical beaches on the North Island down to these subantarctic beaches, we haven't seen a strong trend or change that appears related to global temperature increase. But I think that is something that we may see in the future. Again, it may only influence where it happens, not why it happens.
And a clarification, the huge 200-animal beaching on March 2nd, 2009, was on King Island in the Bass Strait at the northern end of Tasmania. Over the last 4 months, there have been these other large beachings on islands such as Anthony and Scott, and they are all together in that same area at the northern edge of Tasmania, but the most recent was King Island. And it is from those animals that Dr. Baker is going to try to help me make an inquiry formally to the Tasmanian Department of Primary Industries and Parks to see if I can get literal copies of whatever necropsy reports that they are doing on the mass beaching of about 200 animals. And they are doing this, they did take tissue, because 4 in 4 months, each number being larger than is normal, and this last 200 is considered highly unusual and is as puzzling in the Australia-Tasmania area as the Manila Bay in the Philippines only 1 month ago, when 500 melon-headed dolphins would not go out of Manila Bay and kept swimming in very strange, erratic behavior. And Whitley, what I find fascinating is the more I have studied, the more I have talked with people who are whale experts, I did not realize that beachings were such a a really serious mystery to them all.
Linda Moulton Howe, thank you very much for this sobering report. I wish it could have been better news. Next week on Dreamland, Marie D. Jones with a real shocker and an empowering story about numbers. Then we Before this remarkable interview between Peter Levenda and Jim Marrs begins on Above Top Secret, I'd like to bring up some things that are available on the website. There's a new Whitley's Journal up about the economy and why everybody is missing the real reason for the crash. Also, the new 2009 Quick Watch page is either up when you listen to this or will be within the next couple of days. As well, you can follow me on Twitter now, twitter.com, Whitley Strieber. And keep up with me on Twitter. I'm on Facebook, MySpace, and Twitter as well. And with that said, we also have a beautiful premium this week. If you subscribe for 6 months or more, that is not 1 year, but 6 months or more, and have a U.S. address, that is a U.S. address, you will be eligible to receive one of the copies of Above Top Secret that we have to give away this week while supplies last. This offer starts at 6 a.m. Pacific Time Saturday morning and goes on until there are no books left. We have no way of knowing whether you will get a book or not. You must have a U.S. address. You must subscribe for 6 months or longer. You must do this after 6 a.m. Saturday, March the 7th, 2008, and if books are available when you subscribe, you will receive one. This is a premium well worth having, and UnknownCountry.com subscriber section is a place well worth going. We have a wonderful living community there. Every Wednesday night we have an open chat. Ann and I are in attendance, and it's really a lot of fun to be an UnknownCountry.com subscriber. And now let's have some fun and get some extraordinary information from Peter Levenda and Jim Marrs.
My name is Peter Levenda, and I'm going to be your host this afternoon as we talk to Jim Marrs about his new book, Above Top Secret, which has just come out.
It's I've done the same thing. I kind of pick it up and see, oh, that looks nice, and then I get to reading it. The next thing you know, I'm 14 pages on.
Exactly. Well, that's what happened to me, and it's just it's quite an accomplishment. And I think anybody who has just even a passing interest in this sort of thing, they may think they know about, for instance, UFO stuff. Listeners to Dreamland, I'm sure, have read a lot and heard a lot about UFO phenomenon. But there's a lot of different cases that you mention here, and you give a lot of different types of proof and evidence, both for and against these various theories, that it's an eye-opener. And I think that people who feel secure and that they know about this material, picking up your book, they're going to have a whole bunch of different stories to deal with, a lot of different things. I mean, you may be involved in UFOs, and then suddenly you're going to read about, as I mentioned, Nazi bases in Antarctica. It's going to open your mind to different ways of looking at reality. And I think that it's a great contribution. I was going to ask you, what was the most fascinating chapter, I think, from your point of view? I mean, what did you really get involved with?
Well, I think, and of course, keep in mind, I've been dealing with conspiracies, for 30 years, 40 years, I guess. Yeah. The one, though, that really piqued my interest and I really got into writing was the little chapter about, is God an alien? Uh-huh. We rarely ever stop to think about this. And, of course, once I started dealing with that, I realized that there's actually two aspects to that question. One goes back, and I think that people have gotten mixed up a little bit because they read Zecharia Sitchin and they read other material and they read about ancient astronauts. And so a lot of folks kind of have the idea, or at least have the concept, that we, meaning the human race today, may be the offspring of extraterrestrials, which is, for a lot of mainstream people, a very far out thought, and yet there is a lot of...
Jim, how are you?
I'm just doing great, Peter. It's nice to be with you today.
Nice to be with you. I have to tell you, You know, I read Alien Agenda years ago when it first came out, and I read that book cover to cover. I couldn't put it down. And now with your new book, Above Top Secret, it's the kind of book, I mean, it's got chapters on so many different topics, and you think you're going to pick it up and just pick a topic and start reading it. And before you know it, an hour has gone by or 2 hours have gone by, and you're reading all the chapters, and you can't help yourself. You're in a state of agitation. You may think, listeners may think that they know a lot about such things as Roswell, about the Kennedy assassination, about Nazi bases in Antarctica and all that stuff, until you read Jim Marr's book, and then you realize how much you really didn't know. I don't know where to start, really. There's just so much material here.
Well, Peter,
to begin with.
I'm really pleased to hear you say that, because I kind of thought, well, you know, there's so many people out there, and particularly listeners to Dreamland, they're going to go, oh, Roswell, oh, Kennedy assassination, oh, yeah, I already know all that stuff. But the book, Above Top Secret, which tackles about 19 different conspiracy mystery issues, actually would be a great primer, a great starting place for anyone who has kind of an interest but doesn't really know anything about it. And yet, I find out that even people who have studied these issues really like the book and seem to be getting something out of it.
Well, it's true. I mean, you know, I've written about some of these same things, and it's just incredible to me to go through your book and to be reminded of facts that I had forgotten, and to be introduced to things, and to even to different points of view, of which I was, you know, totally unfamiliar before. And the layout of the book is great. I mean, each chapter starts with the who, what, when, where, and why. You know,
yeah, isn't that great? And the design of the book, the folks at Above Top Secret really did an excellent job. It's got rounded corners, and it's very open and very reader friendly, and it's telling evidence that points in that direction. But then that doesn't really address the question about is God an alien? These ETs, if they existed, if they did tweak our DNA and create modern man, they didn't actually create any race. In fact, they themselves said, no, we're not creating anything. We're just kind of improving the breed. Well, you know, we do that today with horses and cows and dogs and cats and other animals, and so, you know, what's the problem to think that they might have done something like that in the past? But again, that doesn't address the question of, you know, were they God? No, they're not God. They're just one of God's creatures, just like we are. And so then you get into, well, then, you know, what exactly is God? And if you believe in a God, but you believe in a God that is separate from you, you know, he's up there somewhere in the heavens on a cloud and has a big G on his sweatshirt or whatever. Well, that obviously makes him alien to you. So then you have to start thinking about, well, if God is omnipotent and omnipresent, and you know, then perhaps we are all part of that. Anyway, it just gets you into some really deep philosophical thoughts, and I found that real fascinating.
Well, I did too. I mean, it's a question that has concerned me a lot in my most recent writing. I've been considering all of these issues. I mean, of course, Eric von Daniken started that whole ball rolling. Yeah. But then, of course, Zecharia Sitchin, as you mentioned, has done a lot of work on that, trying to understand the ancient Babylonian creation epics in terms of alien intervention, you know, and creation of humans.
Well, Peter, do you see it? Do you see this kind of the way I do, which is that you can go to the Encyclopedia Britannica and you can look up Sumerian mythology, and they tell you all about Enki and Enlil and Naharshuk and all of these characters and tell all these stories. And the only real difference seems to be is that Sitchin and a growing number of other scholars are beginning to say, wait a minute, maybe this wasn't just made-up mythological stories. Maybe those people were actually trying to tell us what they knew and had experienced as their history. Do you see that?
Well, I do. I agree with you on that, especially because the most recent research that's been undertaken by people like Blauvelt and some of the others on Egyptian mythology and these incomprehensible pyramid texts and coffin texts seems to point to the idea that these are explanations of astronomical phenomena that were taking place. Mm-hmm. You know, and Hamlet's Mill, of course, goes in into that idea as well, that all of these myths are actually talking about real events, things that actually happened. They're not myths. I mean, they're not myths the way we understand myths. They're just ways of trying to explain something without using technological language, since they didn't have technological tools, in a mathematical language to express it. They had images.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I kind of agree with you on that we are talking about things that actually took place. It's just up to us to try to figure out what that means.
Well, you know what? I think we can see that right now with our own history. Most people, let's say since we're here in December, people go back and they talk about World War II, and as far as most young people know, well, Japan attacked America, and then we went into the war and we defeated Japan and Germany, and that's about it. That's kind of the myth,
Right.
And in a broad sense, that's true, but yet it totally misses all the nuances. The fact that Roosevelt had shut off the oil supplies to Japan, forcing them to take some kind of action, and that the only thing that made military sense was to cripple the Pacific Fleet so we couldn't wage war against them, which means a preemptive strike, just like we've done in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Sure.
And it also fails to take into consideration what is now becoming a historic fact that Roosevelt and a handful of others knew that Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked, and they allowed it to happen